My name is Rosalind McLeod. I'm a teacher of the Alexander technique, and I want to share some information I have about Percy Cerutty, the Australian Olympic athletics coach. It's back in the 1950s when I was at school in Melbourne. One of my classmates was the sister of John Landy, a runner well known in Adelaide, in Melbourne, for doing very well. His coach was Percy Cerutty. And one of the things we heard about Percy Cerutty's training was that he had his young athletes training up and down sandhills. This was at Portsea, about 2 hours out of Melbourne. The other reason I came to know the Cerutty name a bit was that one of the teachers at our school was a Miss Jean Cerutty, and it was only many years later that I came to know that she actually was a sister of Percy Cerutty, the Olympic athletics coach. After that association, I didn't really know anything more about the Ceruttys for a long time. I trained to be a musician, and then I trained to be a teacher of the Alexander technique. It was the mid-1980s. I was now living in Sydney, and I met Marcia Murray. Marcia was the widow of Alan Murray, an Alexander technique teacher. Marcia and her close friend, Dr. Ken Rivett, had a lot of material about Alan's Alexander work. This they gave to me, and I was fascinated to find so much of interest about Alan Murray's teaching in Australia. Alan Murray had grown up in Melbourne in the early 1900s. In the 1920s, he was part of an acting group travelling to America. Alan stayed there, and then in 1939, he went to England. After the war, in London, he trained to be an Alexander teacher with F.M. Alexander. Now, in 1950, Alan Murray and his wife Marcia came back and to live in Australia, and Alan set up a teaching practice in Melbourne. And amongst Alan Murray's material, there was reference to his association with Percy Cerutty. Now, it was well known that Cerutty was a keen investigator of many aspects of life and fitness. So for Cerutty to explore some Alexander lessons would have been quite something for him to be interested in. And I found 3 main references to the association of Cerutty and Alan Murray. Cerutty obviously enjoyed all his Alexander lessons with Alan because he wrote Alan a fine reference, which I'm going to read accurately. Alexander is a must for all competing athletes. You have taught me a lot of interesting material about the correct use of the body, which I have handed on in my training with marked results, eliminating bad use. As well, Marcia told me that during summer holidays when they lived in Melbourne, she and Alan and the 2 children would go down to Portsea and stay with the Ceruttys at the training camp. And this was, of course, where the running up and down of sandhills was a feature of the athletic training. Also, Cerutty sent a number of his young athletes to have lessons with Alan Murray. And in a letter dated November the 19th, 1951, Alan wrote to his friend Kenneth Rivett and made this comment: "Perry, one of my boys, again broke an Australian record last Saturday." So obviously Cerutty was pleased with how his trainee athletes were improving with the Alexander lessons and getting these good results. So the material relating to Alan Murray is now permanently housed in the collection section of the State Library of Victoria. Also, anyone interested in knowing a bit more about Alan Murray, the Alexander Review Journal, an Alexander magazine, contains in the September 1987 issue, Volume 3, Number 2, an article I wrote about Alan Murray and his life. This is the Alexander Review Journal, that issue. This journal is no longer published, but past copies are kept at the Moritz website. That's Mouritz. So go to Moritz Books if you want any more information about Alan Murray's life. So anyone listening to this talk about Cerutty and Alexander technique might be wondering, well, what is the Alexander technique? As a teacher of over 40 years teaching experience, I've heard many definitions of this work, some of them not really accurate. And I've always had an interest in who was F.M. Alexander and why did he have to explore his own fitness and develop it further? And how did he solve his own voice and breathing problems? And why was it then others came to him for help, not only for their voice and breathing problems, but for other aches and pains and stresses? And then today still performers who want to not only improve their skills, but maintain high standards in their chosen profession, whether in the arts or sport, they study the Alexander technique. So I've done a lot of research and I've produced a 70-minute DVD which covers Alexander's life and subsequent developments of his work. So it starts with the birth of Alexander in Tasmania in 1869, then as a 20-year-old moving to Melbourne, hoping to have an acting career, the voice and breathing problems he developed, how he solved them, and then with his improved voice and breathing, how others then wanted to go to him to say, well, can you show us how to improve our voice and breathing? And not only that, he was helping people with other aches and pains and stresses. And then he was teaching and not doing as much acting, and he lived in various parts of Australia and New Zealand. But by 1904, doctors were saying you need to go to England if you're going to make it on the big stage. So in 1904, Alexander went to England and he worked there and in America for the rest of his life. In 1931, he started to train others to teach the Alexander work. And in my DVD is a very interesting interview with Erica Whittaker, who was in that first training course in 1931. And she gives insights into the training that Alexander devised for training people in his work. And then Alexander died in 1955 in London, but by then he'd trained quite a number of people, and since then more and more people have trained. So now there are thousands of Alexander teachers in Europe and in America. So the DVD covers the historical, Alexander's life, but also his legacy and modern-day Alexander teaching, the medical research now being done, some of the science, the new science about the neuroplasticity of the brain. There's also Alexander lesson given by Diana, an Alexander teacher, and there's archival footage of Alexander himself giving a lesson. Plus there are interviews with other people. So the cost of this DVD is $20 Australian plus postage, and all the information is available on my website. The website is simply fmalexanderdoc.com, doc being short for documentary. Thank you.